Hi, my name is John Calvert, and I teach public policy at Simon Fraser University. I'm here in the Comox Valley to talk about the BC government's energy plan and to provide a different perspective than what we normally hear from the government in terms of the, the reasons for the changes in its energy policy, and to provide also, I hope, a bit of information about the long-term consequences of the government's privatization agenda for our electricity system. The BC government has profoundly changed the way in which we now acquire our new energy. The way it's done this is to try and persuade the public that first there's a big energy crisis, and therefore strong measures are immediately needed, and therefore that BC Hydro must buy a very large amount of new energy from private power developers in order to meet this crisis. This crisis, however, in my view, is largely structured or largely manufactured by the government's broader political agenda, which is in the long term to try and privatize our electricity system. And they're doing this incrementally because they know that most members of the public still believe that BC Hydro is a good deal for ratepayers and would not accept that it be privatized. So the government has found a kind of a backdoor method for bringing in private interests into our electricity system and gradually transforming that system from one that's publicly owned and controlled to one that will be effectively controlled by private energy interests and integrated into the U.S. energy market. Now these are significant things I'm saying, and so what's my evidence for it? On the issue of the crisis, what the government has done through the energy plan is to severely limit the options that are available to BC Hydro. It's first said that BC Hydro cannot build any new generating capacity for the province, even though BC Hydro's generating capacity is the basis of our very affordable electricity, and even though BC Hydro has provided a huge amount of money to the public over the years, over the last 12 years, roughly $8.8 billion in water rentals, dividends, and taxes in lieu to the public, a huge amount of money as a result of public ownership of our electricity system. So the government has arbitrarily banned BC Hydro from building anything new, with a couple of very minor exceptions. And instead, it is forcing BC Hydro to acquire more and more private energy. It must do this in the form of long-term energy purchase agreements or contracts with private power developers located inside the province. The government has also made a number of other decisions which have further limited the options that we have available for meeting our future energy needs. For example, we have what are called the Columbia River System downstream benefits. They are based on the treaty that was signed back in 1961 by W.A.C. Bennett with the U.S., in which we agreed to build 3 large reservoirs in Canada on the Columbia River, and this enabled the U.S. to produce a lot more electricity from the dams that were further down the river. As part of that deal, we were entitled to half of the additional energy that was produced by those dams. And currently that is about 1,200 megawatts of power, about 4,300 gigawatt hours of energy, a very large block of energy, roughly 8 or 9% of what we currently use in BC. This energy is being sold by the government in the U.S. and is not normally being included in the numbers in terms of our BC supply. But under the terms of the treaty, we're entitled to have that energy back to BC. And so there, by excluding that large block of energy, they have artificially created the need for more energy to be purchased in BC from private power developers. A second thing they've done to further constrain supply has been to announce that they're going to close the Burrard thermal plant in the Lower Mainland. And this is a gas-fired plant. It has old technology, it should be refurbished, but it's an important insurance policy for the Lower Mainland, and we don't run it full time. We use it only for peak periods, namely in the winter, when we need extra capacity and extra energy in the Lower Mainland. By closing the Burrard power plant, the government is therefore creating additional demand to buy more private energy from power producers located in the province. Now, the way in which these power producers are supplying new energy is that they acquire water licenses, which the government is giving away for virtually nothing. $5,000 for a small water license, a project that might generate 10 megawatts or so of power. $10,000 for any project above that size. Now, when you think about the fact that some of these projects may generate from BC Hydro 10 or 20 or $30 million a year, selling a water license for $10,000 doesn't make a lot of sense from the public's point of view, but that's what the government is doing. And our royalty system gives the public perhaps 2 to 3% of the value of the energy. So the water royalty that we get, it's called a water rental, is just over $1 a megawatt, yet BC Hydro is buying back energy from the same locations that private power developers are building their sites on, or their power plants, for $87.50 or more a megawatt hour. It's a huge disparity. We're just not getting very much for a water resource from these private power developers. Now, what BC Hydro is doing in order to facilitate this, under direction from the government, is it is tendering out for long-term energy purchase agreements from these private companies. The private companies acquire a water license, do some basic engineering and environmental surveying to see that they actually can make a profit from the sites. They bid in on a BC Hydro contract, and if they are awarded a contract, which will normally run from anywhere from 15 to 40 years, is inflation protected. It is a take-or-pay contract, meaning that if Hydro signs it, that we're committed as ratepayers to paying for that energy even if we don't need it. The company then takes this contract to the bank and uses it as collateral to borrow the money to build the power plant. So you and I as ratepayers through BC Hydro are effectively paying off their mortgages for them. The cash flow from our contracts is the effective collateral that they need to build the power plants. And so many of these developers have very little of their own capital. It's a myth that they're bringing new private capital into the system. What they are doing instead is leveraging the value of public contracts in order to borrow money, in order to build power plants, to sell energy back to us. And even though we're paying very high prices for this energy, and extremely high prices, at the end of these contracts, you and I as ratepayers have absolutely nothing. This is totally different from the time that BC Bennett, or WAC Bennett built BC Hydro, in which we as members of the public ended up owning the generation facilities. And after we'd effectively paid off the mortgage, we were able to sell the energy back to ourselves at cost, which currently is extremely low. We pay for our BC Hydro energy from the historic facilities that were built between 1962 and 1984. We pay about 0.6 cents a kilowatt hour. And as a residential customer, you're paying right now about 6.4 cents. So we get very, very cheap energy. The other costs, of course, are the cost of transmission and distribution and so on, which make it up to the 6.4 cents. Private power that we're buying is at about 8 to 9 cents, or in some cases even higher, just for the energy. And so what we're now doing is buying extremely expensive energy to supplement the very cheap energy that we're getting from our own public system. The demand for private energy is an artificial one created by BC Hydro and the government, and it's a demand for energy that in other contexts would be looked at as very low quality energy. The energy that we're buying is normally delivered in the springtime. There is what's called a freshet, which is basically the spring runoff from the melting of the glaciers and also the extra rainfall in the late winter. And so when the runoff comes, you get a lot of energy produced in the Pacific Northwest generally, and in BC, which is hydro-based energy, water-based energy. This is a time in which, because there's a lot of water in the streams and in the rivers, there's a surplus of energy. And we have south of us the Columbia River system with the many dams that the U.S. has owned by Bonneville Power. They're also able to produce a lot of energy at this point in time. That's the same point in time that we're buying energy from these private power developers. So at a time when we least need the energy, we're buying huge blocks of very expensive energy. At the time we most need it, which is in the very late fall and in the early winter when streams are very low, there's much less hydro-based energy in the system, and therefore prices tend to be much higher. That's when we're not buying energy because they're not able to deliver it. So arguably we're buying non-firm energy at a time that's inappropriate because there's already a lot of energy in the system, and we're not getting energy when we really need it because these projects do not have capacity and are not delivering energy during the late fall and early winter. And as a consequence, we're being saddled with enormous future liabilities for buying this energy in the form of these contracts, which arguably are way overpriced. The total amount of money, and this is an absolutely stunning number, the total amount of money that BC Hydro had committed to buying private energy as of last October, according to the Ministry of Finance, amounted to $28.4 billion. Now, admittedly, this is spread over 25 to 30 years, but BC Hydro continues to buy more and more private energy every month. They've changed the rules so that private power developers can now go in and directly negotiate a new contract with BC Hydro if the amount of energy in the project is less than 10 megawatts of capacity. And that means that on an ongoing basis, BC Hydro will be acquiring more and more private energy, and it's already planning a new tender call for next summer. All of this means that you and I as ratepayers are acquiring more and more liability to pay for these incredibly expensive contracts that Hydro is entering into. And down the road, this is going to mean that our electricity rates are going to go through the roof. We're going to have to pay for this. The huge amounts that these developers are now making in terms of asset values of power plants, they're skyrocketing. Those profits are coming straight out of our pockets. These folks are not selling widgets to Texas or Japan or United Kingdom. What they're doing is selling energy to us through these contracts that BC Hydro is committing on our behalf. And so while the developers are going to make an awful lot of money, you and I are going to pay an awful lot more for the energy we're getting. In addition to that, bringing all these private interests into our electricity system is changing its basic dynamic. We used to have a system in which essentially through the government, you and I controlled our energy policy in BC. However, with the government's policy of encouraging more and more private companies to join the system and opening the grid so that they can export energy as well, what we're seeing is a new set of players who are now becoming part of our system. These players are private energy corporations, many of them foreign, who are here because they intend to make money off our system, and who, understandably from their point of view, want to ensure that their shareholders get a really good deal. And their interests are not the same as our interests, and at the same time they're now being given a seat at the table as part of our future energy planning, and they will insist that in the future that the interests of their shareholders are included in all of our future energy planning. A couple of other things that the government has said that are really very misleading to the public about the rationale for its energy plan, I think need to be examined. One is that by buying all this new private power, we're going to get energy security. The problem with that argument is that the government, through Bill 40, abolished what were called energy removal certificates, and therefore we no longer have any provincial control over the export of energy to the U.S. If the government were serious about energy security, it would say that it would not allow private energy exports. But instead it's gone in the opposite direction, opening the grid to private energy exports so that the companies will be free to sell to the highest bidder. And that highest bidder in some cases down the road may well be California. So the more of these private power plants we allow to be built, the less secure we are, because they're free to export that energy. We have no way of keeping it within the province. This is completely different from the situation where we currently have BC Hydro Energy, which we own, and nobody can force us to export that energy. So if we need it here, we can keep it here. And so the government's argument that its policy is providing more energy security is completely misleading. We're getting less and less as more and more private interests get involved in the system. Another argument that the government has put forward is that it needs to have private power because BC Hydro is not able to build power projects efficiently. We don't have any comparator anymore as to the cost of BC Hydro building projects because it's banned from doing so. But we do know that in the long term, it has been much more advantageous for the public to build and own its own assets, its own facilities, by virtue of the evidence from the very low cost that we now enjoy through BC Hydro. And even if the cost of building projects was similar, if they were built by BC Hydro, to what it is that we are paying for private power, in the long term it's still in our interest to do that, because when we essentially pay off the loans that we would acquire to build those projects, as we did in the past, we would end up owning our own electricity and enjoying the benefits in the same way that an individual who purchases his or her house and pays off a mortgage over 20 years eventually ends up living rent-free. Instead, the government's policy is that we're going to be renters forever as a result of the allowing the private sector to own new generation facilities. And so, as far as maintaining any kind of reasonable price controls, the government has moved in a direction that ensures not the protection of the interests of ratepayers in terms of prices, but rather the protection of the interests of investors, who will do very well, thank you, as a result of their ability to acquire private power interests in the province. There are several types of renewable energy that BC is lucky enough to be able to develop. The one type is what is called run-of-the-river or small hydro projects. I always have believed that there are a few of these that may need to be developed, but most of them do not need to be developed. They don't need to be developed because we don't need that energy. Also because it's extremely expensive to develop them, and they're not economic for that reason. If you look at the projects that are being developed currently in BC, virtually all of them are selling to BC Hydro. Why is that? It is because nobody south of the border would pay the kind of price that we're being asked to pay for non-firm energy from these projects. The Americans certainly at this point in time are not prepared to do so. When these projects have been paid off, perhaps their owners may want to sell to the US if BC Hydro is no longer willing to pay the exorbitant prices. But at this point in time, certainly, you and I as ratepayers are the ones who are on the hook to pay for the very high cost of these projects. Having said that, the ones that should be developed are ones where there is minimal environmental damage. And one of the unfortunate aspects of the government's energy policy is that because it provides such a huge incentive for investors to build power plants, and because these contracts are so lucrative for the investors, they have scoured the province to find every possible location where they might be able to build a power plant and sell to BC Hydro, largely regardless of what that means for the local communities, the environment, or the impact in that particular area. And so we have a lot of power plants being built in areas where arguably they should not be built at all. And they do inflict a lot of environmental damage. We have to remember that in addition to the power plant itself, you have a large pond, or in some cases a little reservoir that has to be built at the top end to provide some storage for water, and to also ensure that the silt is is able to filter out of the water so it doesn't end up going through the turbines. You have penstocks, which are basically tunnels or pipes, often 6 or 8 or 10 kilometers long, that divert water around the stream. And these penstocks are often very large. Some of them are drilled through solid rock for 8 or 10 kilometers. And there's a huge amount of debris as a result, a huge amount of rock that has to be moved. And obviously a lot of drilling equipment and other heavy equipment have to be moved into relatively sensitive, pristine areas in order to carry out this construction. In addition, you have the power plant itself and the impact that it has on the environment. You have the need to construct roads, access roads to the power plant, and also roads to service the entire transmission grid, because you have to be able to repair any damage that might happen to the grid and regularly service the grid. And therefore you're providing access roads into, again, areas that are not otherwise impacted by human development. So you have all of these impacts for an individual project, but in a number of the valleys and the river systems in BC, we don't have 1 or 2 projects, we have literally dozens being planned or being built. And when you combine the network of transmission lines and access roads and the impact of the construction in these areas, you're looking at a cumulative impact that's very, very substantial, and that arguably in many cases will change the character of the area and will certainly have significant impacts in areas like tourism, which is often dependent on the scenic beauty of an area, and the scenic beauty is not enhanced by crisscrossing it with transmission lines and access roads. You have also impacts in terms of other recreational activities and the economic activities that go with that, for example kayaking, hiking and so on, where rivers end up being blocked off, and around the power plant you have private property established, and also where you have much lower water flows in the rivers because it's being diverted around through the penstock to the power plant instead of flowing naturally in the stream bed. And so for some groups like kayakers, this may be a major negative impact in terms of their ability to enjoy the benefits of that stream, and in turn, if that community is dependent in part on tourism that flows from kayaking, this may be an important effect that will cost the community jobs and tourism development. The government has, as I indicated earlier, established a process for allocating water licenses to private interests. Currently there are about 535 applications and or water licenses in the system, and more licenses are being acquired month by month. These enable the private interest to build a power plant if they are able to get a contract with BC Hydro. It's a lot of streams that we're talking about here. And there was a recent study that Hydro paid for that indicated that there may be literally thousands of more streams that could be investigated for the purpose of seeing if they may be developed. A number of the locations where you could generate electricity are ruled out currently because there are no transmission lines nearby. And given that most of these projects generate relatively small amounts of electricity, the cost of putting a transmission system into an individual project may make it uneconomic, even at the high prices that BC Hydro is paying. However, when you have a number of transmission lines already built as a result of other projects, then some of the rivers suddenly become economic. And so I think one of the reasons we're seeing even more investigation of potential sites is precisely because as more and more private power projects get built, the transmission system can accommodate new sites in a more economic way. And so more and more of our rivers are at risk as a result. Aside from the whole issue of what we're doing to our streams and rivers around the province as a result of the government's power agenda, the other major source of renewable energy that's at risk is wind energy. Starting back in 1981, BC Hydro did a lot of surveying of the wind energy potential on major locations around the coast and in some of the high ridges on our mountains near the Alberta border. And these wind monitoring studies have identified many of the best sites in the province. However, under the energy plan, BC Hydro is not allowed to take advantage of wind energy. All the new wind energy that's going to be built in BC must be private. The government has been, as it has done with water licenses, been giving out land tenures or investigative permits, as they're called, for private companies to identify and potentially acquire or licenses for sites on all of the best wind farm locations in BC. And literally dozens and dozens and dozens of sites now have been acquired by private interests to ensure that in the future they may be able to build wind farms, assuming that the price is high enough for the energy that they're planning to generate. So this constitutes another major giveaway of a future resource. As with the run-of-the-river projects, these wind farm locations may generate power for centuries, depending on wind velocity and so on. And so it seems very imprudent for the government to give away the future, essentially, to give away the best sites to private companies in the context of everyone realizing that renewable energy is a very important source, and will be an important source of the energy that the public needs in BC in the future, and that it would make sense to integrate wind energy with our existing hydro resources. Wind is a variable resource. It's not what's called firm energy, and as a result, it must be backed up by capacity from another source. We have hydro dams, large reservoirs, which provide an ideal supplement to wind energy, because if the wind is not blowing, we still can generate power through the dams. And when the wind is blowing, we can put the energy straight into our system and conserve the water in the dams. So this is a good balance. By privatizing the wind side, we create a dynamic in which the owners of wind energy are going to be lobbying very energetically to try and get access to our hydro storage, and to try ultimately to push the government to privatize this access so that they will have the right to store their wind energy in our reservoirs, and quite likely to be doing that with the purpose of then selling that energy to the US so that they can claim that it's firm energy, that is high quality energy, renewable energy, that meets the standards that a number of US utilities are now demanding, that they have a certain percentage of the energy that they are using that's from green energy sources. So instead of BC Hydro and the public taking advantage of the wind resource that we have, we are essentially giving it away for almost nothing. The royalties that we're going to get from wind farms vary from 1 to 3% of the facility, of the revenue of the facility, and we're not taking any of these royalties for the first 10 years of operation. So what the government is doing effectively is giving away the future in this area as well. The pattern in terms of wind farm development parallels what's going on in terms of the giveaway of our water resource, and in both cases ratepayers in BC are going to be big losers as a result. One final point I think that's important is to understand that the image that we see of small, locally based, what are called IPPs, independent power producers, is an image that is largely misleading. We are seeing more and more large multinational energy companies moving into the province. Many of the local folks who acquired water licenses, and when I say local folks, I mean the folks in Howe Street who acquired water licenses, are now flipping them. Once they get their hydro contracts, the asset value of their projects skyrockets. They're taking out that capital gain by selling the project to a larger energy company, and we're going to see down the road consolidation, and we're going to see many of our rivers effectively owned by US multinational energy companies, and that is going to be a fundamental change in the both the economic and the political dynamic of energy in BC. In the past, we didn't have to be concerned about U.S. energy companies having a seat at the table and demanding that their interests be represented in the development of BC's energy policy. With more and more private companies in our system and more of them being from out of province or from the U.S., we're going to see these folks trying to change the basic principles under which we operate our energy system, moving it in a market-based direction, moving in a direction in which shareholder interests take precedence over the interests of customers in BC. And I think this is a very negative development for the public.